Why are central banks buying more gold than ever? Central banks, my friends, are offsetting or trying to offset the monetary destruction created by themselves. If we look at this graph, courtesy of Bloomberg, what we can see is that gold has been a phenomenal performer relative to global equities and to European equities, and in line with the S&P 500. However, if we look at the S&P 500, that comes fundamentally from four stocks. So the S&P 496 is way behind gold. Gold has been a very good source of hedging against monetary destruction. And why are central banks purchasing more gold than ever? Let's look at the next graph, because that will tell us what is going on first. 2022 and 2023 has lived the incredible purchasing of gold from central banks. China, India, many of those central banks that are trying to reduce the excessive exposure in their asset base to dollars are purchasing more gold than ever. And why are they doing that? A number of reasons. First, because in their asset base, what they actually have is government bonds. They don't hold currency. They don't hold physical currency. They hold government bonds. Those government bonds usually were stable, low volatility assets that generated stability in the asset base of the central bank. Second, what has happened as well is that with trade wars and with the level of polarization of the world, China and other countries are trying to reduce excessive exposure to the US dollar. This is not de-dollarization. That increase in reserves of gold doesn't mean a shift away from the dollar. The Central Bank of China has about 4.6% of its total assets in gold and about 50% more or less in dollar, i.e. in sovereign bonds from the United States. So let's look at the next graph, which shows us what is going on in this path of monetary destruction. So central banks are basically offsetting what they have done to themselves. They created an excessive amount of money. They purchased a lot of government bonds at the height of the pandemic because of the enormous fiscal stimulus, because of enormous deficit spending, etc. Then monetization of government spending led to higher inflation, as it always does, and higher inflation led to the burst of the bond bubble. Remember that in 2019, the amount of negative yielding bonds in the economy was about $19 trillion, okay? Those burst rapidly, that bubble, the government bubble burst, and it has not recovered yet. And this is an important factor because it leaves phenomenal losses in the asset base of many central banks that need to offset those losses by purchasing real money, i.e. gold, and having higher reserves of gold. Let's go to the next graph, which also shows us how this process happens. First, this is courtesy of the Bank of International Settlements. The central bank massively expands its balance sheet. Two, as central banks bought bonds, the share of interest-free liabilities declined, okay, which is an important factor. Then rising interest rates boost central banks' funding costs, and D, that reduces their net interest income. So net interest income comes down. The asset base value declines because the price of government bonds is lower due to the inflationary pressures created by central banks themselves. So they're basically having to offset the monetary destruction that they have created themselves. Let's go to the next graph, which also shows us what has gone on. Look at what has happened in terms of losses at central banks. It's brutal. United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, enormous losses in the euro area, the ECB. But in the case of the United States, it's also showing significant losses, as you can see below. So that is an important lesson to those that say that printing money does not create any significant problems. And many say, who cares about central bank losses? That doesn't create any problem in terms of monetary policy. Well, Well, it doesn't for you, but it does to everybody, because who pays for central bank losses? You do, my friends, because governments have to cover those losses with higher taxes. Let's go to the next graph and see what is happening also in the commercial bank sector. The enormous losses, unrealized gains and losses on securities at commercial banks, what you see there is the losses. And what does that mean? What it means is that commercial banks have a tremendous amount of government bonds, long-term government bonds, which were supposed to be the stable, low volatility, strong asset that kept the balance sheet together. And actually, what that created is an enormous loss, because inflation came and the price of those bonds in the market declined. The largest problem is that you're creating an enormous hole in the central bank, enormous hole in the commercial bank. Yes, printing money is never free. And this is what happens when you ignore monetary aggregates. Let's go to the next graph, which also shows us why this problem is continuing, which is persistent inflation. Governments continue to deficit spend like there's no tomorrow. Governments continue to generate significant fiscal imbalances that will be monetized in the future. And what you have, as you can see, is the destruction of the purchasing power of the currency, i.e. inflation. This is courtesy of Bloomberg. US CPI continues to be elevated. So, what has happened? Central banks have to purchase gold because they have to offset the monetary destruction that they themselves started by monetizing enormous amounts of government bonds at very elevated prices, therefore disguising the largest bond bubble in history. After the largest bond bubble in history, we saw the decline of the price of those bonds. The asset base of the central banks declined in value, and at the same time, the unrealized losses of commercial banks went through the roof. That is the direct consequence of Keynesian monetary policy. And you pay for it in higher inflation and obviously also in higher taxes. That's why central banks need to purchase more gold to offset their own monetary destruction. And they have a lot more to buy to start to balance adequately. Keep defending freedom. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.